Andy Johnson. This is the first in a three-part series about how to evaluate educational research. Just some basics. Now, this first video looks at how to evaluate and look at all types of educational research, both quantitative and qualitative research. In the videos that follow, we will look specifically at quantitative research and then another looking specifically at qualitative research here. But know, first of all, that there is no such thing as the perfect study. Every study has some strengths and some limitations. Our goal is to become critical consumers of educational research. And there are 5 areas to consider, and we'll look at each one of these regardless of whether it's a quantitative study or a qualitative study. So let's take a look at the first one, researcher credibility. You need to have some background in the field of which or in which you are studying. This background expertise enables you to know what to look for, what's important, what's not, what studies are relevant, what studies are not. Now, I'm an old literacy professor, so I'm going to put this in the context of literacy. So you see me referring to reading a lot because it seems like everyone and their brother and mother and sister does research in reading who are not reading experts. Being a literacy expert is different from being a direct instruction expert. Now, we see this a lot in literacy. Special educators, people in the field of special education who are experts in direct instruction, in behaviorism, but not necessarily reading, not necessarily literacy. As such, they don't know what questions to ask, what data to collect, how to collect it, how to best interpret the data, what the data might mean. We tend to get a lot of sounder-outer research. That is, if you think reading is simply sounding out words, well, you get sounding out word independent variables or treatment, and they collect sounding out word data. But reading is creating meaning with print. Totally changes the data you collect and the questions that you ask. Being an expert in another field does not make you an expert in reading. We sometimes see this with neurosciences who have these research that shows how the brain lights up here, there, and the other thing. And that's good if you're studying the brain, but that does not make you an expert in reading. There are a lot of methodological problems with these brain imaging studies done in reading, most specifically because reading is not simply identifying single words. Reading is creating meaning with print, a context of print, not identifying single words. As well, being a research expert, an expert research methodologist in another field does not provide you adequate background for research in reading. Simply being an expert researcher in physics or science or law does not give you adequate background for most areas of education. I'm sorry, it does not. The literature review is the second thing to look for. The literature review builds on recognized and existing knowledge. It looks at research and theoretical articles that are recognized by the field, not obscure little studies here and there. And that's, again, why it's important to have some expertise in the field. Now, I've seen studies, I've read them, and I read the literature review. That's important. And you get a sense for the validity of the study simply by what they are citing. Is it recognized research, or is it an obscure study or a study that is not well recognized in the field? So sources cited in the literature review, are they credible, and do they represent the field in reading? And again, this is why researchers outside of literacy often provide a distorted view of reading. We see this in special education where only a certain kind of research, a very narrow view of research, is used for the literature review. There's a reliance on controlled experimental research. And of course, The literature review provides a solid theoretical context for the study. It makes a case for why that study is relevant and important. Now, the research question should flow directly from the review of the literature. And again, the literature review is making a case for that study. And a quantitative research tends to have a research question. Qualitative research tends to have a purpose, a study purpose. And you have to ask, can the question be answered by the research question, or can the research question be answered, or the study purpose be achieved? Can you say yes or no to the question being answered or the purpose being achieved? And the big one, integrity. Now, there's no such thing as a perfectly objective researcher that steps outside of time. We all have our biases, but you should state any biases up front. Our biases or conflicts stated. Now, I was reading a research study about a particular reading program, and both the researchers had a financial interest in the reading program. And I knew this from background study, but it was not stated in the study. So do the authors have an agenda? Are they starting with an answer and looking simply to collect data to answer what they already think they know? And this is why when research, and I put that in quotes, comes from think tanks and for-profit organizations, I question them because they have an agenda. Research is not research unless and until it has been subjected to blind peer review. But sometimes even that isn't enough. Does the journal have an agenda? Now, I've looked at the International Dyslexia Association and the Annals of Dyslexia. Only articles and studies that support a very limited and distorted point of view are accepted for publication. Does the journal consider a variety of perspectives, a variety of data, and a variety of research methodology? Are they looking at only a very narrow range? Does the journal have an agenda? And in special education journals, there's what's called paradigmatic parochialism, meaning that they rely simply on controlled experimental studies. There's very few, if any, qualitative studies. Only that which can be quantified is considered worthy of knowledge. And this reifies the outdated behaviorist approach and orientation that we find in special education. And validity and results of conclusions. It should arise from the data. Any conclusions, recommendations, or applications should be based on the data collected. Only that which can be supported by the data should be considered for a conclusion or recommendation. You can't collect data here and make completely different recommendations or applications. As well, the data should not be overinterpreted or misinterpreted. What does the data actually mean? And this, again, is why it is important to have some expertise in the field. I could collect data related to neuroscience and interpret it, but I'm an old literacy professor. My interpretation would not be apt. You have to have some expertise in the field. Should not be overinterpreted or misinterpreted, and it should not be generalized to unrepresented populations. This is why in reading, sometimes you cannot generalize to a specific population based on a larger population. Now, in the area of dyslexia, this is concerning because only 3 to 5% of students have a severe reading disability called dyslexia. So these are very small groups. If you try to collect data from small groups all over different schools and places, well, there's too many variables to control. They have different teachers and backgrounds and this and that. And there's too many. And this is why in looking at dyslexia, many of the studies, in quotes, use students who are at risk for dyslexia. And what that means is any students in kindergarten and first grade who simply have low test scores. So you cannot generalize data to unrepresented populations. All right, part one, evaluating education research.